Well, thank you, everyone, and welcome back to our second session of the summer seminar. Now we turn to the theme of Van Hildebrand on the heart, and this is a particularly important session for really the remainder of the seminar, because it's here that we'll have a presentation of the essential Hildebrandian idea or thought on affectivity and the heart. So I'll just say the briefest word of welcome to our two presenters. We have Maria Wolter joining us from Gaming, Austria, in the vicinity of Vienna. Maria teaches philosophy at Franciscan University of Steubenville's Austrian program, where she is a great popularizer of personalism and personalist ideas. And we get her students back here at the main campus at Franciscan enthused by her teaching. Maria is greatly indebted, as all of us, to the thought of Van Hildebrand and knows him very, very deeply. So we're just delighted to have you, Maria. And then we also have with us Professor Mark Spencer, professor in philosophy at University of St. Thomas in Minnesota. Mark is many things, including quite an expert in Van Hildebrand, and he is a very active collaborator with the Hildebrand Project as a fellow for metaphysics and aesthetics. Mark and Maria are both associated scholars of the Hildebrand Project, so we're delighted to be featuring them here for the two of you. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to the two of you, and as before, I invite people to submit their questions through the question and answer box, and we will pose those questions to our speakers after their remarks. So I turn it over to the two of you.
Okay, thank you. It's an honor to give an overview of Hildebrand's idea of affectivity. And I thought it might be best to go about showing you how truly masterful his re-examination and vindication of the realm of affectivity is, by also giving you a little bit of a backdrop. Dr. Crosby started to do that, and pulling out three ideas that have surfaced that were really important about affectivity, but I think until Hildebrand could not stand on their own and really kind of fell apart. And so this, I think, is the great contribution of Hildebrand. Dr. Crosby already mentioned that affectivity, feelings have had a very long, rocky history. They've been seen mainly as the two enemies of man's essential traits, namely reason and will. Reason and will are always part of the definition of man, of the human person in some way. And they were considered a threat oftentimes because they mislead or cloud our judgment, they sway our will, etc. So they were relegated into the realm of the subpersonal, as Dr. Crosby said, into either the appetites, or sometimes, if they were acknowledged, then they were taken into a very broad notion of the will. So there are three ideas, however, throughout the course of history that begin to surface. The first one is follows right after modernity. The Renaissance has already wreaked its havoc, and then modernity. And modernity has left us with a lifeless universe devoid of purpose, a kind of a meaningless mechanism. The mind, reason, rationality has been reduced greatly to something calculative, geometrical, technocratic. Knowledge has been shrunk. And in this time period, then in 1670, here there's one thinker that stands out, namely Blaise Pascal. So Blaise Pascal tries to overcome these prejudices of empiricism and rationalism. And Blaise Pascal thinks that the solution to gaining access to the more of the universe and the more that reason has to offer us is the heart. And so he says that the heart is the vehicle for reason to penetrate deeper truths. The heart is highly intuitive and yet reasonable. So he talks about a logique du cœur, a logic of the heart. He says it's unprovable, but it's self-evident. So the insight here that develops, not just with Pascal, but he's sort of the real critical forerunner here, is that reason and the heart are necessary to see the fullness of truth. The problem that we have is that, especially Pascal's writings are incredibly fragmented, and it's very unclear what he means by logique and how he can, that it just doesn't stand on any good foundation. there's no systematic analysis. So the first idea, feelings are important for rationality. The second idea then that begins to emerge 70 years later is the first time it's really put out there by David Hume, however impoverished at first, is that there's an important connection between feelings and morality. So between feelings and our access to the good. This idea comes back a lot, especially becomes interesting in the 19th and the 20th century. And there are three very intriguing connections. So the first one I would say is that without feelings, we have no access to value, to the good. Michael Stocker really summarizes this with the following quote. He says, without care, without concern or interest, the world would have no categories. Kierkegaard says, the feelings, especially love, illuminate the world in its significance. And then finally, the lack of affectivity leads to indifference. Indifference leads to boredom, and boredom sees nothing, hears nothing, and renders everything neutral and indifferent. So somehow feelings, it's highlighted, are important for us to even access value, which of course is super important for morality. Another thing that then comes out is that feelings are really important, and Dr. Crosby talked about this when he talked about, I think, the example of the Samaritan, that there's something very deficient about virtue if the feelings aren't there. So Kant, who talked all about pure will, got a lot of resistance. And you could say actually that idea already you find in Aristotle, and Hildebrand quotes it in The Heart, right? The good man needs to not only know and will the good, but he also needs to delight in the good. Aristotle doesn't develop that, but it comes back then several times in many different forms. And then the final kind of connection that I want to highlight between feelings and morality is that not only reason, the scope of reason is widened and broadened if feelings are there, but that the will gains a significant strength. It's important also to sometimes carry the will, and that the heart can play a big role there, and feelings. So for example, C.S. Lewis in his Abolition of Man says, in the 13th hour of bombardment, it wasn't the mind and it wasn't the will that kept the soldiers in the trenches. It was the chest. And I think there's very many interesting parallels between the chest and the Abolition of Man and the heart and Hildebrand, but that's for another story. So the big idea, the big insight is there's a connection between feelings and morality, but the huge problem is the following, that for many of these authors, the suggestion is, the proposal is that feelings give rise to values, so that they create values, right? So that without feelings, there would be no values, which of course seems completely doomed, and we're already on the road headed to subjectivism and relativism in pure. Like, we can really take them seriously, a lot of these thinkers. The third idea in history that begins to come out is also, I think, one that Dr. Crosby beautifully brought out. So just very briefly, it's this connection of what it means to be a person and feelings. So it runs along the lines that he mentioned before. For those of you who weren't here, maybe really in brief, imagine a person who felt no shame, no joy, no sorrow, no compunction, no contrition, who couldn't be touched or moved by suffering or forgiveness or anything like that. Such a cold and lifeless sort of being, we would no longer even consider truly a person. There is something missing, there's something absent. Also in love, it comes out in all of these works on love, because of course in love, what am I trying to do? I'm not trying to win somebody's intellect, not trying to win somebody's will, I'm trying to capture their heart. And somehow the heart is the crown.
Very good. So while we're trying to get Maria back on here, I'm just going to jump in and begin by turning now to von Hildebrand. Maria, I think, gave us a very good background when it comes to this sort of prehistory of looking at the heart and the importance of feeling. Someone's saying something to me there. Okay, great. So I want to turn now to Hildebrand himself. First of all, I've noticed in the chat function here, a number of people have asked for a definition of the heart. So I just want to offer a slight distinction here in a number of ways that we can understand that term. When Hildebrand talks about the heart, he means at least two things. First of all, Hildebrand thinks of the heart as a sort of faculty or power, an ability that the human person has to feel. And he thinks of this power as a spiritual power, that is a power of the soul alongside of intellect and will. Going forward here, we're going to need to understand that term spiritual. I think it's probably going to be coming up a lot as we go forward in this seminar. When Hildebrand and others in the personalist tradition speak of acts as spiritual, they want to draw a contrast between acts that on the one hand are self-conscious, are meaningful, are motivated, that is, they only occur when we grasp some content, as opposed to acts that are purely caused in us, acts that arise in us without us having to grasp anything. So in the realm of feeling, you can think about this distinction. Some of our feelings are purely bodily feelings. That is, they happen in us whether we are understanding their objects or not. Think about basic pleasures or pains. Think about the feeling of hunger. Think about the feeling of elation or euphoria that happens after you've drunk a bit of alcohol. All of these are bodily feelings. They don't require you to understand or grasp anything meaningful before those feelings arise. Contrast that to spiritual feelings. Spiritual feelings are feelings that arise only when we grasp some meaningful content. And those are the feelings that Hildebrand is particularly interested in when he talks about the heart. So the heart is this ability that we have for spiritual feeling. Sometimes Hildebrand talks about heart as encompassing feeling in a broader sense. So this is a second sense of heart. Heart can mean the ability to have any feeling, any affection, any emotion whatsoever. Finally, third, by heart, Hildebrand means the core of the person. That experience we each have of a sort of center to ourselves where we feel things deeply, where we act truly as persons, where we would say, yes, that's me acting, that's me feeling, that's me experiencing. So that core of the person. If we're going to understand Hildebrand on feeling, if we're going to understand Hildebrand on the heart, we need to especially understand the objects of feeling. What are the things that we feel when we feel in a spiritual way? And both of our speakers so far have talked about value a bit. And I want to say a bit about what value is and what Hildebrand means by value, but I see that Maria is back on. So I'm going to let her jump back in if she's ready. And then I will talk about value, these objects of feeling, a bit later in the panel. Go ahead, Maria.
I am so sorry. Where did I freeze up? Did the first, the equivocation of feelings, that was heard? Yes?
Yes. Yeah, you were talking about how feeling, how the heart is the crown of our actions. It's important for fully acting as a person, and without it, we wouldn't really be acting as full persons at all.
Okay, fantastic. So again, my apologies. So now, how does this relate to Hildebrand? And Hildebrand, I think, gives us three major distinctions that help bring to light everything and provide a foundation. So the three contributions that Hildebrand makes, the first one is that he says the biggest problem with affectivity is that we've equivocated feelings. So we call them all feelings, but in fact, there are essential differences with feelings. And so he distinguishes between bodily and psychic feelings and spiritual feelings on the other hand. The bodily and the psychic feelings, he says, are non-intentional, intentional in the phenomenological sense. So they're not meaningfully related. They're caused. So I have an incredible headache. I don't need to know what caused it. There's no meaningful relationship with the object, but it's simply caused. And this is the case for these bodily and psychic feelings. You read it in the readings. And then the spiritual feelings are different because they're intentional. They're meaningfully directed to an object. So he said, it would be impossible to just wake up one day and say, I am so envious. And then somebody asks, well, what are you envious? I have no idea. I'm just envious. It makes no sense. Or I'm in love. Well, who are you in love with? I don't know. You see, he said spiritual feelings, they're motivated by something. They're motivated by an object that we have to cognize first. Otherwise, the feeling cannot even arise in us. So there are two essentially different categories of feelings. This is his first big contribution. The second one is that they don't just spiritual feelings don't just presuppose any cognition. They presuppose that I have cognized something important, that it's either positive or negative. So for example, when I see a man beating a child to a pulp with a whip, if I just see a neutral fact, I will not respond effectively. I will not have a special feeling in response to this. It's not until I recognize that that's horrible, it violates the dignity of man, it violates the dignity of the child, that then I can respond with anger, etc. So spiritual feelings don't just presuppose a cognition, they presuppose an importance, but Mark will talk more also about that, or started talking about that again, I'm sorry. And the third then conclusion of that is that he says, spiritual feelings are responses to objects. So they are personal, from me, from the subject, a response to an object. In the cognition, I receive content from the object, yeah? The importance that's in the object, positive or negative. But in the feeling, the content comes from me. I am adding something, yeah? So, and they are responses in two ways, in an active, a fully active way, or an actively receptive way. So we also have feelings where I receive the content more deeply. I'm joined more deeply to the content. So for example, when I see my two children in an unusual or more rare, really profound act of love, that penetrates me, it pierces my heart, yes? And I'm joined in some sense to the value. Just kidding, my children are always loving. Anyways, so how is this important? Now you hopefully start to see why Hildebrand's re-examination is so great, because what it does now, go back to the connection that I mentioned between feelings and rationality. Huh? So Hildebrand would say to Pascal, not all feelings are rational. Not all feelings have a logic, right? But now you can explain, because we've systematically analyzed our experience and we've seen that some of them have a logic in the sense that they are reasonable because they presuppose cognitive content, yes, of a very particular kind. So, and then also they do widen the scope of reason, because it isn't until I can watch, for example, you know, human trafficking and all sorts of terrible atrocities or beautiful, spiritually beautiful things. And if my heart isn't engaged, then somehow I haven't penetrated the fullness of the value or the disvalue that's occurring here. Yeah, so they widen reason, but it's not a one-way street. And this is so important in Hildebrand. Hildebrand is all about integration. So it's not just that feelings add to reason. No. Reason plays a huge role for feelings. And he has a whole chapter that Dr. Crosby mentioned about the hypertrophy of the heart, when the heart becomes over-engorged, affectivity takes over. And you see, so what's the role of reason here? The role of reason is, first of all, to figure out what kind of feeling it is. Because see, it'll make a huge difference. A psychic feeling, these kind of moods or certain types of depression that are chemically induced, versus a spiritual feeling, a heaviness that I feel because of sorrow or guilt or something, because I've recognized something. This is totally different. I mean, I can medicate one, I can't medicate the other, I can't treat them the same. So that has huge practical implications. So the first task of reason is to look at what kind of feeling it is. The second task of reason is then to critically examine it. Yes, has it seen the fullness of the importance, negative or positive? Has it seen the whole of the importance? Yeah, is it appropriate to whatever object? So this is a critical role of reason. Okay, so then the second connection between feelings and morality, right? So remember this whole idea that we don't have access to values without feelings. And remember Hume and Hildebrand would say, well, Hume, you're right. Feelings give us values, but not in the sense that you mean. They don't create values. They have a privileged access to values. They reveal to us values that sometimes reason is slower to realize, yeah? Because again, he agrees with Pascal, there's this intuitive moment of the heart. And so the heart can penetrate a situation very, very quickly at times, yeah? Sometimes also be blind to it. So Hume, you aren't true to the experience of how feelings work. Our feelings don't operate in a vacuum. Spiritual feelings require the cognitive content, and they require already a value perception. Otherwise, the feeling won't be engaged. Yeah. So this is what Hume, you got wrong. Then, of course, also, yes, he would say that virtues are defective or deficient without the heart. Yeah. So he completely agrees in that with that. And he says to the third point that the heart can carry the will. He says, look how much further you would be willing to go if your heart is engaged, if you're not just driven by pure will. Yeah. If you really love or delight or rejoice, then, I mean, how much more effort will the will put into something? Again, it's not a one-way street. It's not just that affectivity helps the will. No, and this is a huge, important moment in Hildebrand, where he says the will has to relate and integrate with the heart, and the will has a very threefold, on the number 3, function for the will. And he develops this not in the heart so much, but in his ethics, chapter 17 and 25, where he talks about the will has to sanction, it has to say yes, it has to foster, commit, keep alive the positive feelings, otherwise they will die. That's the bad news. It has to confront and say no and disavow, not subliminate and repress, but it has to face the bad feelings, look for the root and get rid of the root. Yes, and that otherwise the bad feelings grow, and that's horrible. And the third thing, and that's one of the most powerful things, I think it'll come back tomorrow, is the will has to indirectly influence the heart. And it's super powerful in this because our affectivity is so influenced by our surroundings. And then the final point about this connection between feelings and the being of the person. Yeah. So Dr. Crosby already mentioned some really important ones. He writes a whole chapter. His chapter 8 is called The Heart as the Real Self. Okay. So the heart for him, what is the heart? Wait, before I go into what the heart is, what's very important as a clarification is he says, with the exception of the moral life, he's very clear. He says, in the moral life, the will reveals the true self. Yeah. What I do is who I am. Because my choices also shape me as a person. But in so many other areas, important areas of our life, the real self can be found in the heart. Incidentally, as a kind of a fun fact, it was the Sacred Heart, he was a convert, and he was really befuddled by the devotion that Catholics have to the Sacred Heart, because he said, well, why the heart? Why not reason and will? Those seem to be more prominent in the person. And so this really kind of took him down an avenue philosophically then to ponder it even more. And so for him, the heart, yes, is representative of man's most interior life. It is the root, the heart is the root and the center of this spiritual affectivity. Yeah? It's the place where the treasures of the most individual life are stored. So my deepest secret, my most intimate word is spoken. Newman, since we were just talking about Newman, has that beautiful phrase, cor ad cor loquitur. Yes, heart speaks to heart. There's a moment in which, right, that encounter that can only take place if the two hearts meet each other. Huh? So in so many important ways, the true person, and it's absolutely fascinating. If you're looking for Viktor Frankl in his Man's Search for Meaning, talks about the third stage of the prisoners in Auschwitz and how apathy is a self-defense mechanism and it means emotional death. And he doesn't look at it philosophically, but really describes the experience of how the reason, will, and the I are shut down. That's why it's a self-defense mechanism. Yeah. When I shut down my feelings, I guard myself. I protect myself. I push people away. So to conclude, again, agreeing with Dr. Crosby, the heart is a very important part of man. It's a very important center of man. Reason and will are more obvious, but the heart is another essential thing and somehow stands in the middle, I think. Somehow is kind of a core, and it feeds the other two faculties in a very important way and determines how deep the life on those can be. So thank you very much, Mark. My apologies again for the interruption, etc. But you were going to talk about importance.
Yeah, so I just want to pick right up on some things that Maria said there. Can everyone see me? Say in the chat there if you can't. Great, thank you. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the objects of spiritual feeling. What does spiritual feeling aim at in this object-directed way? And Hildebrand makes some really important distinctions here, and I also want to bring in some distinctions from a phenomenologist and personalist that Hildebrand drew on quite a bit, and who was a friend of his early life. He's been mentioned already this morning. So first of all, Hildebrand makes this distinction between three kinds of importance that feeling can be motivated by. So when we have these affective or emotional responses to things, we can first of all be motivated by, or we can feel the importance of what he calls the subjectively satisfying. That which is subjectively satisfying is that which, just as the word sounds, feels satisfying to me, but it's not important in and of itself. It might be something that I find satisfying entirely for selfish reasons. It's something that just, fits my tastes. The fact that I'm subjectively satisfied by chocolate chip cookie dough ice cream is purely subjective. There's nothing important in and of itself about that kind of ice cream. So first, I can feel the subjectively satisfying. I can be motivated by that kind of importance. Second, I can be motivated by the importance of that which is objectively good for me. That which is objectively good for me is that which fulfills me as a human person. There are certain things I need as a human person that you need as a human person in order to flourish, to be fulfilled, to be all that you can be. You need things like food and water. You need things like shelter. You need spiritual things as well, like knowledge and experiences of beauty and so forth. Each of these things is an objective good for you. It fulfills you whether you subjectively want it or not. You ought to subjectively want it, but it is objectively good for you. It fits with the structure of your nature. Okay, so we can have feelings about what's subjectively satisfying. We can have feelings about what's objectively good for us. But Hildebrand is much more interested in a third kind of importance, which he calls value, or importance in itself. So Hildebrand notes that we can pursue things in a morally good way just when they're objectively good for us. But that's not the highest way in which we can feel things. That's not the highest way in which we can be motivated by things. It's much higher, it's much more indicative of our life as persons when we are motivated by things that are important in themselves. When we recognize the objective morality of some particular action, when I recognize that I ought to tell the truth, not just because the truth is fulfilling to me, but because the truth deserves a response in and of itself. Or I might recognize that a beautiful landscape deserves a certain response. Yes, beautiful landscapes are subjectively satisfying to me. I enjoy them. They're pleasant to look at. Yes, they're objectively good for me. They fulfill certain powers that I have, my intellectual needs, for example. But much more important is the fact that a beautiful landscape calls for a certain response. When Hildebrand and Scheler talk about the experience of value, they're talking about an experience that we have in which things out in the world call for a certain response. they demand a certain response. When I see the beauty of a landscape, it calls for admiration. It calls for amazement. To not give admiration and amazement to the beautiful landscape is, in some ways, to fail to give it its due, to be, in a sense, unjust towards it. To fail to have love for my wife and children, to fail to feel love for them, is not to give them their full due. To fail to feel adoration and reverence for God is to fail to give God his complete due. So Hildebrand wants us to focus in on these experiences of value, these experiences in which our feelings transcend ourselves, go beyond ourselves, just like Professor Crosby was talking about in Newman, and we focus on the object itself, and our feelings themselves are a response that is due to that object. We'll be talking about this more going forward, especially in a couple days when we talk about the relationship between morality and feeling. But just to sort of preview that, Hildebrand has this idea, and we've seen it already when Professor Crosby introduced the business about the Good Samaritan, that a full response, a full due response requires feeling, requires these spiritual affections. And that's explained by the fact that we experience values out in the world, that we perceive these properties, real properties that things have, which call for a response. Okay, so going forward, let's keep in mind that threefold distinction of ways that things present themselves as important and as motivating of feeling. We've got the subjectively satisfying, we've got the objective good for the person, and then most importantly, we've got those values or importance in themselves. I want to introduce two more distinctions very briefly, so we have time for questions and answers. First of all, Maria talked about how when we're thinking about our own feelings and we're trying to educate our feelings and we're trying to feel well, feel in a way that is moral and truly indicative of our life as persons, we need to have a sort of critical reflection on feelings. In order to do that, it's helpful to distinguish a number of kinds of spiritual feelings. So I've already talked about one, the due response to a value. Values call for things like love, reverence, adoration, respect, esteem, these sorts of feelings. Disvalues, ways in which things are sort of negatively important in and of themselves, they call for repudiation, maybe even righteous anger, and other sorts of feelings of that sort. So we can have feelings which are a due response to values or disvalues. We can also, Hildebrand says, be affected or be moved by values and by other kinds of importance. Sometimes when you're looking at a beautiful landscape or a beautiful painting or a beautiful person, you feel a feeling of being affected by that, of being drawn to that, perhaps a longing for it, perhaps a spontaneous wonder or awe about it. So we can have these experiences in which we are affected in our feelings by things out there in the world. But prior to all of that, we have to be aware of the value. Maria talked a good deal about this. And here's somewhere where Max Scheler, Hildebrand's friend early in life, is really helpful to us. Scheler points out that even our awareness of value is itself a kind of feeling. He calls it value perception or value feeling. When I see the value of, say, a great athlete, right? The ability that he or she has in their athletic feats, when I see that calls for a sort of admiration, perhaps even emulation in my own physical life, I grasp that through a sort of feeling, right? I feel the vitality of the athlete. I feel the strength of the athlete. And then I'm moved by that, and hopefully I give a due response to that. But first of all, there is a kind of feeling in which I am aware of the vitality reality of that value of the athlete. Or when I'm perceiving the beauty of a landscape, I feel the beauty of that landscape. It affects me on the emotional level, and it's only through those emotions that I grasp it. So keep in mind those different sorts of feelings: value perception, being affected, due response. There are others we can talk about in the Q&A if you want to. Last distinction I want to introduce, and then we'll go to the Q&A. We need to make a distinction between kinds of values. And Hildebrand and Scheler spend a vast amount of space in their books or in their articles distinguishing out different kinds of feelings, different kinds of values, and the way that different kinds of feelings and values correlate with one another. So we can distinguish things like values of holiness, values of aesthetics, beauty, ugliness, picturesqueness, and so forth. Values that belong to morality, values that belong to truth, values that belong to vitality and strength, and so forth. So we can distinguish out lots of different kinds of values. Each of these values calls for a different feeling. It would be inappropriate to feel the sort of reverence we have for holiness, for the holiness of God or the holiness of a saint. It would be inappropriate to feel that for an athlete, say. But there's a kind of admiration, a kind of esteem that's due to the athlete, which is appropriate there, but would be inappropriate to feel for the saint or for God or for someone holy. So part of getting a good handle on our emotional life is parsing out all the different kinds of values, different kinds of importance in themselves that present themselves to us, and then figuring out how different sorts of feelings correlate to those different sorts of values. There's lots more I can say about that. Probably more will be said over the course of the week. I'll stop there so that we've got a little bit of time for questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you, Maria, for your remarks. That was very deftly done by the two of you. I know, unplanned to weave in and out of each other's comments, but thank you very much. We have many questions that have been submitted, also many appreciative remarks. Maria, I think there's a lot of awe in your ability to come right back and keep going where you left off. So thank you very much for that. So there are, again, sort of categories of questions here that are coming in, and let me begin with one. I think this maybe, Maria, I'll address to you while you're with us. And so there is the question actually posed by Rocco Buttiglione, who is with us, whether let me see if I can pull up his question, whether the heart is just the affective side of man. Could we say that in another sense the heart is rather the synthesis of the person, the will, the affectivity in the intellect, and whether or not you accept that particular formulation? There are other questions about that ask about the integration of heart and will, heart and intellect in particular, as you formulated it. And there are also some questions that ask for more clarification about how these centers relate back to the person. So if you want to make any comments on those line of questions, you'd be welcome to. And of course, Mark, feel free to chime in as well. The questions, I think, ultimately come down to this integration of the heart and the intellect and the will.
So I think they're fantastic questions, and I have been grappling with this for years, actually, like how to place and how these relate. So I think what the first really big important thing for Hildebrand is to recognize that they're distinct. So, and he already works this out in the ethics, right? Where he simply says you can't conflate them. The heart can't get lost just and absorbed by reason and will. This is very important. But reason and will, right? They aren't completely separate either. I mean, freedom depends on rationality. If there were no rationality, there would be no possibility for freedom. There would be no possibility for, so in some sense you could say rationality is foundational. So is rationality it, you know? But, and so I think what Hildebrand's trying to get at is when you come to, they have their distinctive separate activities, but they have to work together. And until they work together, none of them can achieve what they're meant to do and what they're meant to be in their fullness in some sense. And I do think, though, I'm coming more and more to the conclusion, and actually I've been teaching theology of the body in recent semesters, and I think that this whole central notion of the heart, that somehow the heart is kind of there's a really important aspect in which is the core of it all. Yeah, it's pivotal. I mean, even Aristotle, I didn't mention this rationality, but Aristotle says something really interesting. He says, if we don't teach our children to like what is beautiful and dislike what is ugly, they will not understand what is true and what is good. They will not love what is good. And so, and to me, this is fascinating, because I think in our day and age, we ignore the realm of the heart, or the education of the heart, or how we can affect the heart entirely. So the important takeaways for me are they are distinct, they have distinct activities, but they play together. And if they don't work together, then this is very important. And then the third one is that there's a kind of a centrality, because there's a depth of the personal life that can only come if the heart is there. That would be, I think, how I would answer that for now.
Let me just...
do you want to add something?
Yeah, can I just add a little bit to that?
Sure.
So I think it's important whenever we're making these kinds of distinctions between intellect, will, heart, sense, whatever sorts of things that we can do, that all of these are distinctions among things that one person does, right? When I feel, when I act, when I think, it's me doing it. It's not as if there are these sort of little modules within me, right? Little people up here in my soul or in my brain or wherever that are performing these different sorts of actions. Rather, there's one person acting, there's one person feeling, there's one person thinking, willing, sensing, whatever it might be. And it's helpful to distinguish different kinds of acts insofar as it helps us get a better handle on what we do as persons, how we can be fulfilled as persons, how we can relate to others as persons. So we can recognize, yeah, I relate sometimes to others, to the world, through thinking. That is, I grasp things insofar as they are true or intelligible. And sometimes I relate to the world through willing. That is, I relate to the world insofar as I can affect something about their... And some relate to the world through feeling. But in every case, it's me, this one subject, this one center, this one substance that performs these different sorts of acts. And once we make that distinction, I think we can maybe distinguish two sorts of heart. I alluded to this earlier. There's heart in the sense of the person, the me, the one who is doing these sorts of actions. And then there's the heart, maybe in a sort of more specialized sense, the person insofar as he or she acts in a feeling sort of way. And I think it's important to keep those two senses of heart distinct. And then once we do that, we can talk about all the ways that these different sorts of powers weave together and so forth.
Very, very good. Mark, while I have you, and Maria, feel free to comment on this as well. You spoke earlier, I think both of you addressed the meaning of spiritual in von Hildebrand as referring to the structure of motivation. But there's a question here that asks for a little bit more clarity. And Mark, I know you have often commented on this. So the question is, could you provide some contrast between von Hildebrand's definition and understanding of spiritual and, say, St. Thomas's definition and understanding of the same term? It would be helpful to see how von Hildebrand differs from other philosophical figures on the term. Again, there are more sessions in which all of this will be addressed, but there are lots of questions here that seek clarification, so I thought I'd throw this one to you.
Yeah, so it's difficult to parse these things out at times because there's a lot of terms here: spirit, soul, intentional, personal. We would need to sort of tease all of the meanings of these terms out. Here's a point of contact, though, I think, just to sort of very briefly address this question. Here's a point of contact between a scholastic like St. Thomas and a phenomenologist, personalist like Hildebrand. As I said earlier, when Hildebrand talks about what is spiritual, he's talking about acts that we perform in an intentional and meaningfully motivated way. Contrast that or connect that then to what St. Thomas and other scholastics talk about as acts of the soul, sometimes acts of the spirit. These are acts like thinking, like willing, which relate to their objects insofar as those objects are grasped in a universal way. That is, insofar as we in some way rise above the particular, the here and now, and we grasp things insofar as they are intelligible. Right? I can look at you and sense you as a particular human person, but then with my intellect, I can grasp what it is to be a human person, not this or that human person, but what it is to be a human person in general. And with my bodily feelings, my bodily instincts and so forth, I can react to particular things in my environment. But when I act through the will, I am acting with respect to things in a way guided by universal rules of action, say the rules of morality. And so we've got this idea of the spiritual as what transcends the particular, what transcends the here and now. And I think a way of thinking about what Hildebrand is up to is he is trying to expand our notion of these acts of the soul or acts of the spirit from what we get from the scholastics. And he's trying to help us recognize that acts of feeling do this too. Acts of feeling transcend the here and now, and we can have these feelings that relate to the beautiful or the morally good. And I think he's also trying to expand our notion of what is intelligible. That is, that we can grasp the particular, we can grasp the here and now in a spiritual way. That the spiritual is not just what transcends the particular and is universal. The spiritual, that is, where we grasp the meanings of things in and of themselves, that relates to the particular as well. And so I can intellectually grasp the particular for Hildebrand, and I can relate through my feelings to the importance of the particular in and of itself. So I think you should think of it as a sort of expansion of, or at least an attempt at an expansion of this scholastic framework, but very much in continuity with it, if that helps.
Yes, thank you, thank you. There are quite a number of questions here that address, again, you might say, some misfunctioning or imperfect functioning of the heart. So there are questions here about the heart in cases of spiritual dryness, or in cases of mental illness, particularly in cases of people who for some reason simply can't live a robust emotional life. But then there's also a line of questioning here that has to do with the formation of the heart. And I thought maybe I would invite both of you to say something either out of von Hildebrand or your own thoughts about this question of forming the heart. In other words, people are asking here whether our feelings are more or less just they arise as responses, or do they sometimes not arise, or can they be imperfect, and do they require education, shall we say, in the same way that our minds and our wills do? So if either of you could comment on that, that would be, I think you'd be addressing many questions here.
Maria,
Okay, sure. So I think that part of education, part of formation has to, for Hildebrand, include the formation of the heart. And this is something that, I mean, this makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? When you have children particularly, I mean, one beats the other over the head and then they start laughing at it, and part of the whole thing that you're trying to teach them is not just that you understand that this is wrong and you don't do it, but that you also get a sense that this kind of taking delight, the Schadenfreude, is inappropriate, right? So you're trying to help them channel, or you need to, and I mean, again, something that's been neglected. How to do this? This is something, I mean, Hildebrand touches on something so important, and that is that beauty here is very important, and this whole indirect influencing of the heart, that the will, so it's the whole environment, that plays into this. I mean, you can't expect a child to have a pure heart, or a deep heart or a rich heart if the child is surrounded by just simply, shallow things. If we don't fill our mind with things that are deep and rich, etc., or if we don't surround ourselves so that we see things, this is why, and beauty has a very important role to play in quickening the heart. And again, this is something that Aristotle, I think, sees very clearly, and why it's so important. And it's something that we completely disregard because, you know, nowadays in school, bring your favorite piece, and it can be something from death metal or something from Mozart. And as long as you like both of them, right? I mean, we don't make a distinction anymore whether something is beautiful or not beautiful or ugly. It's such a, and so the heart then really will suffer from that tremendously. One question that I also saw in the chat box is, you know, the will, and this is one of the things that those who've emphasized the importance of the will got right. The will can jumpstart the heart. William James talks about this when he says, you know, sometimes you have to act as if you're happy and then you'll feel happy, in the sense that the will is incredibly important, and just because the heart is there, the will can't choose, like Dr. Crosby said, not to do something that is right. But when the will continues to do this, the heart then many times will also be able to join. You know, it can be activated. I mean, one last comment that I would make is about, you know, it's a very interesting, I mean, this would be a whole nother study, that the relation between these psychic feelings and these spiritual feelings. So what do you do with people who are incapable, children who simply, you know, or types of personalities or temperaments or kinds of defects where the emotive life is somehow shut down, you know, on the psychic level, and how can there be parallels? Does the one then affect the other? I mean, the body clearly affects the soul. If there's something on the level of the body that isn't functioning, it will impact us on some level, you know. But this is, I mean, he doesn't go into that in greater depth, but it is interesting food for thought. So that's just throwing a few thoughts out there, Mark.
Yeah, let me it's so beautiful. I mean, I think that's absolutely right. And I think that key point about beauty is really like the most important point. And it's important to emphasize that for Hildebrand, beauty doesn't just mean aesthetic beauty. It doesn't just mean the beauty of, say, paintings, musical pieces, and so forth. Those are super important. But on Hildebrand's view, every value has a sort of beauty. There's a beauty of the courageous act. There's a beauty of the just act. There's a beauty of holiness. And so holding up those sorts of examples to ourselves, to our children, to our students, and so forth, is really crucial for training the heart, which part well. I want to bring in one sort of opposite point. It's from Scheler. And Scheler talks about how asceticism, denying yourself certain feelings, certain pleasures, can also train the heart. And he's got this image of sort of constricting the flow of water. When you are an ascetic, when you discipline yourself, when you deny yourself certain pleasures, deny yourself certain feelings, and in a sense, focuses those feelings, focuses those pleasures on precisely what they ought to aim at, and they become much more intense. And there's a sort of training of the heart that comes through that self-denial. So I would think you sort of need both. You need both the self-denial, right, the fasting, and you need this exposure to genuine beauty of all sorts, sort of feasting side of things. And through those two, you get this training, this habituation of the heart to feel well.
Thank you. Thank you to both of you. Well, we are sadly again at the end of our time. Time goes so quickly in these presentations. So thank you to you both. And I know there's virtual applause for you coming from around the world. These practical questions that have come up in all sessions so far, in the 2 sessions so far, I hope that people will continue to ask them throughout the seminar. That's is a theme like the heart, and certainly in a thinker like von Hildebrand, his philosophical, his philosophizing, his philosophical theory is never far away from ordinary experience. He's trying to enlighten experience, trying to deepen our experience, trying to develop an account that we can live by. And I think we can all see how existentially rich his commentary has been, even in these first two, in this first session devoted to his thought. So let me just, by way of some housekeeping here, just announce that those of you who are full participants of the seminar, you all should go now to your small groups. and you've received emails with links to those, and you'll have a discussion with 8 or 9 of you, moderated by a member of our faculty. So this is the time to go there. And then as far as the seminar itself is concerned, we continue, of course, with our keynote sessions tomorrow morning. This afternoon, the seminar continues. Those of you who are full participants or benefactors of the Hildebrand Project, you know how to join those sessions, and please do. And I invite, of course, anyone who would like to see those sessions who is not a full participant. You can see those on Facebook, where we will be streaming those live. So you're at least able to see those sessions there. So I invite you to go there. So again, Mark and Maria, thank you so much. And I know we'll be hearing more from the two of you, and I look forward to seeing or continuing to be with all of you as the seminar continues. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.